Welcome to the Melbourne International Film Festival School's 2019 program, bringing languages and learning to life as immersive international cinema for students. We are excited to offer this free teacher webinar as part of a valued collaboration between MIFF and MLTAV. The focus of this webinar is the wonderful Italian documentary Butterfly. This is a story of Irma, butterfly tester, who became Italy's first ever woman boxer to compete in the Olympics. This film is scheduled to screen at the Sofitel Melbourne on Collins Auditorium on Wednesday 7th of August, 1:30 p.m. and Tuesday 13th of August at 11 a.m. The full details of the MIFF 2019 Schools program, films, locations, session times, as well as information on how to secure a school booking can be found on the MIFF website under the MIFF Schools link. MLTAV member schools can take advantage of reduced ticket prices for school bookings, as well as one teacher per 10 students attends for free. I would suggest booking as soon as possible though, because seats do fill quickly for these films. Our presenters for this webinar are Josh Nelson, film specialist, who will share some of the technical and artistic aspects, and Gabriella Bertolesi, our language and culture specialist, who will focus on language and intercultural insights. This webinar is a valuable resource to introduce teachers to the film and provide suggestions and give examples as to how teachers can work with students in the classroom, both in preparation for seeing the film and afterwards, including how aspects of the film can be linked to the Victorian curriculum. Questions will be invited after both Josh and Gabriella have spoken. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Josh, who will then hand over to Gabriella. I'll come back at the end just to facilitate any questions and answers and explain the certificate of participation process. So thank you, Josh. Over to you.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, Gabriella, and welcome to our live participants and to those who are listening back or watching this back via the archived version. So as Kerry just mentioned, the first part of this webinar presentation is going to focus on some of the filmic language, the filmic construction of the film, and opening this up to film analysis or film-specific analysis within the classroom, in addition to those language and cultural aspects that Gabriella's going to talk about. And I think that's important from the perspective of building up that visual literacy, particularly for younger students who may not have encountered it before. And of course, this is a valuable skill that certainly comes into play through VCE in terms of English, EAL, literature, and certainly media studies as well. The emphasis on analysing visual text as visual text, as opposed to sort of just literary text. Before we leap into the sort of the nitty-gritty of that, I think just to recap basically the kind of the plot or the synopsis of Butterfly. So as Kerry mentioned, it focuses on Irma Tester, nicknamed Butterfly. So there's a sort of a reference there, I think, to Muhammad Ali, who was the first female boxer to represent Italy at the 2016 Rio Olympic Games. And she did so as an 18-year-old. So there's a focus on gender and age in this, which is really fascinating. And the documentary focuses a little bit on the lead up to the Olympics and then the aftermath, when she returns to her hometown in Naples and starts to question or look towards a possible life outside of the ring, even at this very young age. Okay, so moving on to the kind of film language and building up some terminology. And I'd suggest, particularly for lower level students or students who haven't really analyze film text in this way, to maybe establish some terminology or basic fundamentals of filmmaking before the students attend the screening, so they've got something that they can hang their kind of critical viewing experience onto. So the kinds of things that they really should be looking out for: the use of cinematography. You know, why or where do the filmmakers use close-up or wide-angle shots? How are they using it? How do they alter our perception of, in this case, Irma and the various other subjects within the film or the settings within the film? The other key element really is mise-en-scène, and students should have a basic understanding of what is mise-en-scène. That is this production element that incorporates a variety of things such as props, costumes, lighting, the composition of images, and so on and so on. How do filmmakers communicate through purely visual means ideas about character setting, themes, etc. And obviously sound is the other key one. Sound, music, dialogue, voiceover. And again, not all of these elements are present within this film, but they're things that I think students should be on the lookout for. The other key elements which come into play, particularly here in Butterfly, narrative structure, the use of story elements even within the documentary genre or documentary frame of the film, the use of editing, and of course visual motifs and symbolism. And I'll touch on some of these as we go along. I mentioned in previous webinars that perhaps a useful strategy is to assign certain production elements to either students, individual students, or groups of students to then report back in class what they noticed and how they thought that affected our understanding of the film in terms of prompting that classroom discussion, rather than all the students be on the lookout for all of these elements. And I think that particularly for students who aren't well versed in film analysis, sometimes that can be a little overwhelming. But again, these are all aspects to consider in addition to those the key language and cultural aspects. So moving on to a more sort of focused analysis of Butterfly. Some of the key themes that I think this film explores and prompts for classroom discussion. Even though the film features a boxer and is obviously focused on a life in and outside of the ring, the film's not really about boxing per se, but it's an unavoidable point of discussion, I think, particularly given some of these other issues or themes that it raises. And one of the most prominent ones, I think, is the issue of gender in sport, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Also, the focus on the body, the physicality of the body, both in and out of the ring, the influence of media, and particularly social media. Again, this is the subject of this documentary. Is well, I think she's 16 when we first meet her, and then 18 at the Olympics. So very much of an age close to presumably some of the students who'll be attending this film. The theme of family, themes of isolation and self-doubt, but also you could throw in there persistence and fighting against adversity. So again, this film is not negative in that sense, but also has, I think, an empowering message at its core, and issues of class and unemployment. And again, I'll touch on these to varying degrees, and I'm happy to come back to any of them in question time at the end. So I think it's useful, or one possible strategy when approaching a film like this in a classroom context, is to start in a broader sense, to try and encourage students to consider this film in relation to their own viewing habits. Have they seen other documentaries in this case? And Butterfly is an interesting case study in that sense, that it employs both the conventions of a sports documentary and a personal profile documentary. And I think what it does, and what a lot of great documentaries like this do, is that they explore the intersection of sport, of the media, gender, cultural beliefs, and in this case, the economic realities of contemporary Italy through this figure, through the subject of Irma Testa. So using the individual to explore broader social themes and issues. And I think that's what really recommends this documentary. It's quite an intelligent documentary, I think. And it also attempts to provide a deeper understanding of a public figure. Now, I hadn't actually heard of Irma Testa prior to this documentary, but the documentary certainly makes it clear, and any Google search of her will make it clear that within Italy she has quite a substantial following and was quite a figure, particularly in the lead up to the Olympics. So similar documentaries, themed documentaries that this brought to mind. Hoop Dreams, that fantastic documentary from the mid-90s following two African-American teens with aspirations to play professional basketball. Shadow Boxers, a fantastic film about female boxing in the late 90s. And also Speak Up, which was a documentary, a French language documentary on last year's MIFF Schools program about a debating team. So a non-sport documentary, but again, using individuals within that competitive documentary context and looking at various themes, particularly class, race, religion, and cultural aspects. So I think the other useful element of a documentary in a classroom context is the kinds of questions it prompts about the form. And often I think there's, particularly with younger students, there's an assumption that documentary equals reality. And I think it's important for teachers to sort of unpick and deconstruct this for students, that a documentary, just like any other form of filmmaking, is filtered through the filmmaker's consciousness. It's constructed, it's a narrative form. It's not an unfiltered representation of real life. And again, you could bring in examples of reality TV to kind of unpack that for students as well. So prompting students to think about where in the film does it appear that the filmmakers are potentially presenting their own kind of bias? Have they set out to present Irma in a positive or in a negative light? Why have they decided to show certain aspects of her characters, and do they appear to be hiding others, for example? In what ways is Butterfly similar to fictional or narrative films that they may have seen, particularly if they've seen other films about boxing narratives, whether it's Creed or Rocky, or any number of films that they may have watched, or even just broader sporting films. And again, that last sort of question, is the documentary a more truthful representation of reality than other types of film? It's a sort of loaded question, but I think these are useful prompts to start discussion about a film like this. So just in terms of those kinds of questions, moving on to this issue of narrative structure and having students think about this film in relation to other types of filmmaking or narrative films. And I think what's interesting about this is that it follows fairly closely a dramatic structure similar to the hero's journey. And this is the monomyth made famous by Joseph Campbell, where he laid bare the kind of key elements that seem to go into the mythical narrative, which is now the formula, the standard formula from, say, post-Star Wars of Hollywood blockbuster cinema. And I've noted a website, a very basic resource that you could use in classroom discussion, which breaks down the various sort of 12 steps of the hero's journey. And I think that could be useful to consider how the film adheres or differs from those 12 kind of key steps. Because if you look at the 5 I've sort of picked out, it begins with the advent of the journey, Irma leaving home to train outside of her hometown, the kind of countdown to the Olympics, the building of tension, and then the aftermath of the Olympics, dealing with personal failure, the sense of maybe carving out a new direction. And again, it's not quite a spoiler, but the hero rising again at the end. So the film is structured in a way that certainly recalls any number of other sporting type narratives, underdog narratives, hero narratives, particularly things like, let's say, Rocky or the Creed franchise. In terms of the other sort of building blocks of the film language or visual literacy, it's important that students have a basic understanding of, say, the close-up and the wide angle and how they're used within the film. And the close-up really is about connecting us and creating an identification with the subject on screen, in this case with Irma, but also with other characters or other subjects within her narrative, within this documentary. And by contrast, I think the wide-angle shots are often used in terms of identifying the audience with setting. And setting, I think, is crucial. The image that I've picked there is an image that occurs towards the beginning of the film, where she's left home and she moves to Assisi, to the training base prior to the Olympics. And the filmmakers often use these wide-angle shots to highlight Irma's isolation within the narrative. And you can sort of see her in the bottom of the frame there, again, sort of dwarfed by the rest of the world around her. And again, this is a recurring visual motif that the filmmakers build on to emphasize an aspect of her character. The other aspect in terms of the use of the camera and character and setting and themes within the film is the use of handheld cinematography, often and repeatedly filming Irma from behind. And again, I think there's a number of reasons why the filmmakers have done that. One is part and parcel of the documentary form, and that is it creates a sense of immediacy. It emphasizes the sense that the camera is following her around on the spot at every turn. But the other thing that approach to shooting her in that way does, it almost creates a sense of emotional distance, because where we're seeing her from behind. We're disconnected from her. This is different to the use of, say, the close-up in the previous slide. So again, it has a dimension of character, of themes in terms of personal isolation. And we see that often in the lower two images, where we see Irma within a crowd setting. And the filmmakers often emphasize her detachment from the crowd, that sense of isolation again. So thinking about, or prompting students to consider different ways in which she's filmed within the documentary, and how our perception of her changes according to her relationship to the camera, or the camera's relationship to her. Mise-en-scène, again, I mentioned this in the breakdown of those filmic techniques at the beginning. The filmmakers are quite, I think, conscious in terms of using the background and using certain key locations to comment on either Irma's character. And again, we have a sequence where her and her friend are in what I presume is Irma's bedroom, and suddenly we see her surrounded by all these soft plush dolls and teddies and so on. And it's a stark reminder, really, of her age. It's almost easy to forget at a certain point that she is still a teenager, and attempting to deal with these sort of the pressures and the lofty ambitions that she's imposed upon herself. But also in that top right image, the way in which the mise-en-scène of the setting and the hometown of Torre Annunziata emphasizes, I guess, this industrial context. And this is her and a group of friends, again in a wide-angle shot, drinking on the rocks next to the water. And I wanted to flag these two bottom shots as well, because this film has a very sophisticated use of camera work that is more in line, I would argue, with typical narrative cinema in terms of the position of actors within the frame. This does not seem like an off the cuff, on the fly position of the subjects. So the use of the coach in the background, Irma in the foreground, emphasizing a spatial distance between the two of them. And again, on the right-hand image, with the friend abandoning a scene in which there's been a bit of an argument and her walking down the corridor. These feel almost staged in terms of looking at the images in isolation, even though in the context of the scenes, they don't feel that way. So there's lots of scope in terms of the visual design of the film to pick up on in classroom discussion. I mentioned setting just a moment ago in terms of Torre Annunziata, her hometown in Naples. The film emphasizes an economic situation within that, but also, interestingly enough, contrasts it with the sequences of the Olympics in Rio. And here you have two towns or two cities, both on the water, but also both very different in a number of ways. And I think the film deliberately emphasizes these points of similarity and difference, and Irma's differing relationship to the two settings. So again, there's certainly scope for the students to pick up on those similarities and differences, and how the filmmakers are emphasizing one potentially over the other. I mentioned isolation at the beginning, but again, I think it's important to, when discussing these themes, to come back to how do the filmmakers present that sense of isolation. To look, really prompting the students to look beyond just dialogue or sort of interview sequences, but think about the visual design. And really, boxing is both, I think, a cause and a symptom of Irma's isolation. She confesses very early on in the film about not wanting to have any contact with family or friends because they're seen as a distraction. And I guess the kind of consequence of that is that she reinforces her own sense of isolation. And we see that in, again, wide-angle shots that the filmmaker uses from a distance in the boxing ring. She's the only one there. She's there by herself. And again, later in the film, where she tries to book a holiday, and her intent is to find the furthest place from the rest of the world. The ends of the earth is her preferred destination. So again, in different contexts, the isolation persists for her character. It also struck me, just on this theme of isolation and her sense of maybe detachment from the world, there's a number of sequences and interviews, scenes that take place inside modes of transport, often cars, taxis, and trains. And it's a curious recurring motif within the film. And I think you could argue it does have a thematic element to it as well, that it emphasizes her lack of stability in terms of home, that she's always on the go. She's moving from Torre Annunziata to Assisi or to Rome and back and forth. But filming her within these contexts also, I think, emphasizes her detachment from the world. She's not really connected. She's not in and moving around the people in her world. And often when she is, she seems detached there as well. So again, I think prompting students to kind of consider why filmmakers have decided to include these particular sequences. You know, why not just shoot her on the street or in the home or in the gym? I mentioned media at the beginning and suggested that was certainly something students would be able to relate to. It's interesting, particularly early on within the film, the way the media constructs a certain idea or personality of her as the kind of the great Italian hope, the medal hope at the Olympics. And then we see the kind of the backlash take place, particularly on social media. And there's a very poignant scene where she's looking at comments underneath a Facebook thread about her and very cruel, often misogynist comments as well. So again, I think it's certainly something in terms of students' relationship to social media that they'll definitely be able to relate to and connect to and have their own sort of feelings and share their own sort of feelings about how does the media construct sporting heroes? Does it create too much pressure? Do we put too much pressure on these kind of young idols that the media largely constructs and then again sort of takes them down? The Australian tall poppy syndrome. Certainly, I think you could bring that up within a classroom discussion. But it's almost impossible to talk about that or the film more broadly without engaging the issue of gender and gender in sport. And again, just linking this to the concept of the media, there's a sequence where she's interviewed for a television broadcast. And again, the types of questions that she's being asked are things like, do you have a boyfriend? Do you prefer a mini skirt or pants? I think it would be interesting to relate debates about gender in sport to recent controversies, say in the AFLW, the Taylor Harris incident, the photograph, which created a sort of a storm of controversy because of the horrific way in which that was received online in terms of the misogyny of the comments, or even the way these women are referred to as female boxers, whereas men are referred to just as boxers. Thinking about how language reinforces difference within sport. Again, these are certain broader issues that are I think, at the forefront of media discussion and discourse right now. Again, in terms of sort of like linking these various themes, the body is unavoidable in a boxing context, and you have within the film itself, within the documentary, an interesting interplay between the body being prepared and honed and tightly controlled in the lead up to a sport like boxing, and then boxing. I guess the paradox is that it's there to destroy bodies as well. And again, this film is not certainly not graphic in terms of showing the bouts of boxing. In fact, most of the sequences refer to reaction shots. So we see other people watching the sport of boxing, but you get the paradox played out within this film. You know, her coach catches her drinking at one point, and she says, "I'm not drinking, I promise." You know, we get to see that the young side of her, that really she's still a teenager at heart, even though she's been built up as this great hope. And one moment which I thought was really quite fascinating, when she's on the verge of giving up boxing and she gets a piercing inside her mouth, and she talks about how painful it was. And again, the strange relationship between bodies and pain, and that she wants to leave behind the pain of boxing, but then she goes and sort of has this, without getting too psychoanalytic, goes and inflicts this other pain upon herself. Last couple of slides, and then I'll hand over to Gabriella. The theme of family, I think, is interesting. We get a fairly decent sense of a troubled family life, the absent father, the surrogate father as the coach, the sister who was also wanted to be a boxer, but sort of now given that up, the younger brother who is working various jobs as a 13-year-old and not attending school. And particularly, and perhaps most fascinatingly within the film, is the role of the mother, who even says at one point, "I had to be both the mother and the father to raise you growing up." and that's why maybe I wasn't there so much. So again, there's a kind of complex depiction of the family and Irma's relationship within that really shapes over the course of the narrative our understanding of her and maybe her relationship to boxing. And again, I think that ties into economic questions about class that link to her decision to stay within the sport of boxing or even get involved in the sport of boxing. And you could look at this in a broader sense, not just in terms of Italy and the state of Europe, but other countries as well. And certainly that ties back into questions about setting. And lastly, I think everything sort of comes full circle quite nicely at the end. We have an image, and this is not a spoiler at all, but an image of Irma on a train. And again, the final frame really is of her staring at her reflection. So how has she changed over the course of the narrative? What is the lasting impression that the filmmakers want to give to the audience about her character and what she's gone through? And does it have is it a positive message? Is it empowering? Is it sort of a indeterminate sort of status? Where does it leave the audience and our relationship to her character or her as a subject at the end of the film? I might hand over now to Gabriella, but I'm happy to pick up on any of these issues I've raised in questions.
Josh, thank you very much. That was wonderful, a wonderful exploration of the main themes and sub-themes of the film. And I have to say that I actually found the film offers such a rich exploration of many of the issues under the main themes of you could have it as commitment, and then sub-themes which I'll talk about and can interpret later, gender, sport, work, the world of school, the work of society, etc. But I also found myself cheering at the end of this film for Irma, and I'll certainly be looking at her in the 2020 Olympics to see how she goes, because it's such an inspiring, wonderful, wonderful film that I think is extremely suited to students, to school students in a number of settings. What you have online now is an actual link to the trailer of the film. So if anybody would like to see the trailer, I suggest you do go to the link. And MIFF does recommend this film to be suitable for ages 12 and above. I'd certainly agree with this. And in looking at the curriculum links and where you can actually use the film in terms of a classroom, a formal structured classroom study, I would say that obviously a secondary target audience is what I would be looking at. Possibly year 9 through to year 12, definitely levels year 9 and 10. And if you are going and using in your school the F to 10 curriculum, there are obvious links which you can directly identify with achievement standards and with the topics and subtopics or with the strands in both F to 10 curriculum and also 7 to 10 sequence if that's what you are using. There's also links in terms of direct word links with the VCE study design. So in terms of an exploration of a topic, of language or of culture that you could use in the classroom using the mode of film and then linking it for your assessment to achievement standards, there are certainly very strong possibilities to do that. So very quickly, I'll go through some of the Victorian curriculum languages, links and strands or sequences and where I see this film fitting in. As we know, the Victorian curriculum languages has a broad focus on language and culture. And on the screen now, you can see sort of the aims of the study. So learning to communicate, developing language awareness, intercultural skills, developing openness to different experiences and perspectives, and develop skills in negotiating experiences and meanings across languages and culture and reflecting on language use and language learning. I can certainly say that language use and language learning is very strong in this film, given the amount of dialect within a certain context. And you could actually spend weeks just exploring a language component, looking at dialect versus standard Italian. And for example, I will actually talk about it later, but aspects of the dialect, tone, grammatical structures, for example, use of the dialect and references to standard Italian or when it's used. In terms of F to 10 sequence, I feel that under communicating, socializing, informing, and reflecting in particular, the film can lend itself to those strands or substrands, and in understanding those three as well: systems of language, language variation and change, and role of language and culture. Very strong. In the year 7 to 10 sequence, again, similar opportunities to link this film to those areas of the commitment. Of the curriculum. And I've also actually given you a link to the scope and sequence for Italian, where you can find those descriptions. In terms of achievement standards, when we come to reporting, we do address the achievement standards. So I've just pulled out some of the achievement standards that the film can lend itself to and is applicable to. In terms of, and I'm looking at level year 9 and 10 here. So in the F to 10 curriculum, some of the points in the achievement standard is they discuss topics such as education, work, the environment and youth issues. Use present, past and future tense as a grammatical point. Sorry, I've repeated that. They discuss future plans and aspirations, reflect on experience of learning Italian language and culture. Dialect can come into that. Consider how speakers make choices when using language and make connections. And they reflect on their own and others' use of language, cultural assumptions. The film is so rich in linguistic content, and obviously it's tied into location, and it's also tied into class, but also to experiences. And we'll talk a little bit further about that later. If we are relating to the achievement standard for the Victorian curriculum year 7 to 10, sequence and year levels 9 to 10, again we have quite a number of dot points that can relate. So exchanging information about broader issues of personal significance, communicating thoughts and opinions, making comparisons, providing presentations, responding to a range of questions, using meta-language to analyse and discuss features of language choice, such as use as a cultural practice. Recognising Italian language use varies according to context, purpose and mode. Very strong. Consider social and cultural practices of Italians in Italy. Reflect on ways which language and culture together create meaning, and recognise the role of language and culture in shaping experience and the ways in which their own past experiences shape their identity. Irma is certainly a role model in how her own past experiences shapes her identity, and how her notion in the theme of commitment actually leads her from a life she has to another direction in her life, although it does require commitment and a lot of determination, but a bit of alienation on her part as well. So in terms of the VCE study design, I looked at the Italian 2019 and beyond, which is the new study design. And again, the scope of the study looks at student participation in interpersonal communication, interpreting the language of other speakers, presenting information and ideas in Italian on a range of themes and topics. The film certainly has a rich array of things to speak about there and to discuss. And also understanding, students being able to develop an understanding of the relationships between language and culture in new contexts, and consider how these relationships shape communities. Irma in the film comes, as Josh has mentioned, from a small part of Naples called Torre Annunziata or Annunziata, and language and culture, the language she uses within her immediate family and within her environment and with her coach in Naples is obviously in her own dialect, whereas then we have an exploration of language when she's in the national training team, for example, or as Josh mentioned, I think he also highlighted the language and the type of language used when she's being interviewed in a more formal setting. So very rich exploration of language and culture. I think the understanding the relationship between language and culture is strong at VCE, and this film certainly lends itself to that exploration, as well as cultural contexts in which language is spoken. I've just mentioned a lot of times the use of dialect, and making connections between different languages, knowledge and ways of thinking. In terms of prescribed VCE themes, topics and suggested subtopics, these are the ones that relate directly to Italian, and I've actually pulled out 3, 5, 7 of them where the film could easily fit in if you are exploring these topics or subtopics, or actually you could be mixing many of these. And if you just look at these: personal identity, lifestyles, relationships, education and aspirations, Italian cultural heritage, living in an Italian community, global and contemporary society, so women in sport or sport generally, or opportunities for employment, schooling, and communication and media. So the role of media in developing characters, personalities, media or communication language, and telling of the story. In doing these webinars, the MLTAV uses a framework called NICE, which is notice content on many levels, interpret the content, create another language-based text type, and evaluate the experience in engaging with the work. So I've put some subheadings here using these 14 themes. So the first thing I've said here is that Butterfly offers a rich exploration through the main theme and various threads. As I said, you'll be left cheering for Irma at the end of the film, and hopefully your students will too, and they will find it so inspirational that hopefully they will switch on and see how she does do in the 2020 Olympics. So although Josh, I know, has explored a number of themes or sub-themes, I think many of them can be linked under the main theme of commitment. We can see Irma's commitment to sport, to achieving her goal. We see other people's commitment, though, to sort of continuing their daily lives. For example, her mother is committed to keeping the family together, and sort of, you know, the sacrifices she makes for doing that in the amount of work she does. The commitment the coach, for example, has to his students, and the commitment, possibly the negative commitment that her brother starts off with in terms of his pathway in life, and which hopefully she tries to change by getting him to stay in school. Threads to explore: sport, female identity and opportunities, Italian culture broadly and locally, as shown in Torre Annunziata in Naples, role models. And in that note, in terms of this setting and versus the national setting of Irma, as we see her train and on her possibly 2-year path to get to the Olympics, I think we can look at an exploration of aspects of language and culture because of the use of dialect in the film. It's quite extensive because it is used within the family context, within her local context. And so we could, for example, ask students to look at who speaks in dialect when and what the use of dialect achieves, and comparing dialect to standard Italian by focusing on words, expressions, intonation, colloquialisms, and grammatical structures. For example, Irma uses the dialect exclusively with her coach. Her mother speaks to her. It's in a family context. She speaks in dialect to her sister, or with her sister and with her little brother. And in the scenes where the collective scenes of celebrations, community celebrations, etc., it's dialect. It's also dialect in the use of songs. The mother and Irma at one point break out in singing when they're cooking, and also sort of in the celebrations, in the religious celebrations that come through. So comparing the dialect to standard Italian by focusing on words or expressions would be a study in itself. You could spend so many lessons doing this. So study of cultural aspects could include life in Torre Annunziata, daily routines, events and celebrations, the youth culture, aspirations, opportunities, school and work, parenting, role models, stereotypes, beliefs and traditions, local environment and music. So the daily routines of the people, the going to work, the events that they celebrate. There's a lot of religious festivals. There are religious festivals that are shown, and that can be a rich cultural aspect to explore with classes. The actual street scenes, or the scenes with the beautiful illuminati, these little lights that are used, and luminari, and when the Madonna is lit up, for example, and is carried through the street, or the fireworks that go with that. So the celebrations that bind the community together. the youth cultures that are present in the film. So you have Irma's exploration of her own life, but you also look at her brother, what's he doing? Her sister, what's she doing? Her sister, who also was training in this circle of boxing, who then gives up this aspiration or then chooses a life where she basically becomes a worker, stays in the local area, and appears to be a young mother, and has particular aspirations. What opportunities are available to the brother, to the sister, to other friends within her community, who, as Irma has said, sort of even she was wagging school at 13. So those of them, like her brother, who is starting to abscond from school and seems to be going in a different path and really wants to just work selling fish. And what aspirations does he have? How can that be changed with schooling, but also with a role model like her? And the role of work and the world of work. Irma's mother, for example, works two jobs and works extremely hard. And at one point, I think, as Josh mentioned, takes on the role of both father, absent father, and mother. And when asked by Irma why she doesn't realise that the little or the younger brother or her son is actually skipping school, is actually told, well, I don't have time for that. And Irma's comment to her was at that point, well, you didn't seem to know what I was doing when I was missing school as well. But the mother then very sensitively talks about sort of her commitment to the family and to work, and how she had to work to keep everyone together, and gives a different perspective to Irma. But the opportunities faced. So parenting, that leads into parenting role models and stereotypes, beliefs and traditions, the local environment. It's a harsh local environment. It's a hard one. But even Irma, she belongs in that environment, but she also seems to sort of be moving away from that environment, and yet she keeps returning to her local environment. It's her identity. And then the role of music. As we all know, Neapolitans love music, and songs in Neapolitan are so heartfelt, and there are a couple of scenes in this film where the actual music or the songs that you hear are actually in Neapolitan. So noticing the language. So prior to attending the film, perhaps encourage students to think about the use of language, dialect, and the language of youth. And after the film, you could ask students to reflect on who they noticed in relation to, to reflect on what they noticed in relation to who, when, and where these different forms were used. Pronunciation, stress, intonation, and maybe looking at a study of an individual in the film, someone who is actually speaking in dialect, or even the reporters and reporter style. As Josh also mentioned, this notion of what's important to develop a national, I suppose, marketing figure, someone who's going to go into boxing, who's going to be the hope of Italy in female boxing. So she's asked things like, yeah, do you like wearing pants or a skirt? Do you have a boyfriend? But it's the clipped tone that is done with, and the structure of the language, which is reporter language. It's actually language that's used in the media. So that in itself could be a study further on. Culture. So exploring the theme of commitment and the notion of youth culture and Italian culture stereotypes, including family, friendship, and aspirations and gender. This film is really breaking the stereotypes of where girls can go. Mm-hmm. And for example, at the start or near the start of the film, we actually have a short scene where Irma and her sister both say that they started off learning ballet at the gym, and then they they both went on to do boxing. And there's also a beautiful scene of a young girl looking, this beautiful open face looking, and you can hear a boxing sort of routine at the back. She's obviously in the gym and she's looking at the trainers. This little girl comes at the end of the film as well, and we see her in the final scenes where she actually starts to talk to Irma. So she's actually, we realise, looking at Irma training and being prepared or preparing for the Olympics. This is after her rise and demise in the 2016 Olympics, and she's preparing for the 2020. And this little girl sort of says, you know, I want to be like you. I want to aspire to be like you. So the role of gender, where it can lead you, where it can't lead you. And the stereotyping, including jobs. The mother's job, for example, her two jobs are relating to providing food or cooking in a restaurant, etc. The young boy, Ugo, her brother, is working at 13 in selling fish. Her sister, when she leaves work, the scene on the rocks, for example, in this very industrial setting near the sea, the sister is leaving work and has come back, and it seems that if she may have been selling, she may be selling at a stall or something geared at tourists, and some of the other women have just come from a canning factory or a factory, something to do with fish. Exploring the Italian school system, notions of class and opportunity, sport and role models, there's such a richness in this film about that. So after a film, you could ask your students to identify the cultural aspects of the film they've noticed and what's similar or different to their own in growing up, and the notion of stereotypes, how they are reinforced or discarded, and that can also be done through the role of media. Here's a little snapshot of a scene of the little girl, and you can see the boxing theme at the back, so she's in the boxing gym. And this is how the film starts. We hone in on her and we see her pictures. So interpreting content. So the young girl in the boxing studio focused on a setting, the sound of boxers. So following the film, students could explore the theme of commitment and aspirations by writing what it means to them. We could identify the main characters, noticing what, for how long, and how they commit to what they commit, and what doesn't make them or does make them succeed. You could also have students reenact a scene from the film. The subtitling of the film, Interpreting and Creating, is a rich opportunity to explore translating. So subtitling and the asking film students, perhaps obviously this depends on their level, whether they're middle school or whether they're senior students, but using their knowledge of Italian to see if there are any interesting translations or things that were missed. Comparing the dialect in interesting translation is also possible. There could be also, apart from the subtitling, you could actually even do a short list of some expressions in dialect and their relationship or their equivalent in standard Italian, and just sort of try and look at the differences in the actual pronunciation or in the spelling, etc. So here's another example of subtitling. So this is Irma's coach, who is actually reading an excerpt from a newspaper article about her, where she's quoted as saying that my sister was my idol and me, I wanted to become a nun. And then he makes a comment in dialect saying the last thing she did was want to become a nun. She was actually running and annoying the nuns when she was a little girl. So the themes and aspects of Butterfly to potentially explore, as Josh has already said, are just almost never ending. The notion of commitment, dialect, its use, personal identity, youth culture. And in youth culture, you notice that Irma and her mother and some of her friends have tattoos. What are they? Who else wears tattoos, for example? Aspirations, alienation. Irma is alienated. She's alienated in a number of scenes and also through her journey and her commitment to her sport. Optimism, contemporary Italy, sport and its significance, schooling, employment, career options, stereotypes, innocence lost and found, role of family, humour, and even the name of the film. Why is the film called Butterfly? It is actually Irma's nickname, so she is known as Irma Butterfly Tester. But what does a butterfly do? And when I interpreted that, I thought that Irma is transforming herself into someone more skilled in her field. She's called a champion, but like a butterfly, she transforms herself into a real athlete, despite the failure of not succeeding to win gold in the 2016 Olympics. So there are many issues to explore, and you could take any of these. Another one that I haven't added in there is the role of religion and its impact on culture.
and society, because there are, as I said previously, there are so many so many parts of this film that actually look at religious scenes, and they're usually done in a group environment, the role of the community, the role of the family. So in terms of creation, prior to attending the film, students could survey each other, identifying types of films they like, and survey students at their sister school if they have one of what's popular in Italy. They could also engage students in planning an excursion and do all the paperwork relating to that, or putting together survey results. Following the film, students could write a blog, a film review, notice interesting cultural events or key events. They could do an own film proposal. This is quite sort of, I suppose, something geared more to a VCE class. But alternatively, students could identify feelings that they felt, or put sort of a cultural context and look at the cultural associations and list aspects of the films within different themes or cultural notes. In terms of evaluation, reflecting on the experience of watching the film, engaging with Italian language and dialect, use of subtitles, understanding of Italian language and culture, was it enriched by viewing Butterfly? Did the film broaden, in terms of an intercultural context, the understanding of contemporary Italian language and culture and aspirations? What did they like about the film? And other things, how were music, dialect, setting and discourse form used to set the film tone? Finally, was the film inspirational? This scene sees Irma on her way. She, in a way, claws her way back to getting ready to commit to trying again, to get into the national team, to win the European Championships and to represent Italy in the 2020 Olympics. If you notice her tattoo on that, on her arm, it's actually of a woman. It's very interesting. So the final scene before the acknowledgements says Irma has won a bronze medal at the Europeans and is now training for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. So aspirational that I intend watching her, and I hope that everybody else who explores this film with this class will actually watch the 2020 Olympics and see Irma as well.
So thank you, Gabriella. Before we move to see if there's any questions, I'd just like to thank both Josh and Gabriella for sharing their interesting and thought-provoking insights and suggestions into this film and how to work with students to make the experience of seeing it valuable, enjoyable and educational. Collectively, they've certainly provided a rich sample of thoughts and ideas in viewing, thinking about and working with this film. So I'd like to thank also Anna and Michael for joining us this afternoon for the live webinar. And I'd just like to invite either of you to ask any questions of Josh or Gabriella. Michael, I'm just turning on your microphone or enabling your microphone. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask. Or you can always type it in the chat screen if you had anything. I'll just continue to explain the certificate of participation process. So for engaging in the live webinar, or whether anybody participates with the archive version of the webinar, which will actually be made available after tonight on the MLTAV website on the homepage under What's New in Languages Education, as well as on the MIFF site under MIFF Schools program. Oh, fantastic. Okay, thank you, Michael. I'll actually just paste the survey link in the chat screen as well, which might be useful because that will then be recorded into the chat history. So yeah, it's on the PowerPoint slide there. It's also in the chat history, and I also have that link directly from the MLTAV website in the same section under What's New on the homepage. Thank you, Anna. Michael, that's fantastic. No questions. So again, I'd like to thank Josh and Gabriella. A really rich presentation and certainly lots to think about. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a good night. Thank you. We'll sign off now. Bye.